They say love makes people do crazy things. But what happens when that love turns into obsession? When the person you once trusted becomes your worst nightmare? These aren't just messy breakups. These are stories of manipulation, revenge, and terrifying encounters with exes who refuse to let go. As you listen, ask yourself, how well do you really know the person you once loved? And if you've ever had a crazy ex of your own, would you have seen the warning signs before it was too late? Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced something like this. Now, let's dive into 3 disturbing true stories that prove some relationships don't end, even when they should. It started like any normal breakup. I thought I had made the right decision. The relationship had been suffocating, and it was clear that we weren't meant to be. But when you leave someone behind, sometimes you don't realize that you're not just walking away from a person, you're walking away from a darkness. A darkness that, for a while, had been hiding just beneath the surface. Her name was Maya. At first, everything about her had been magnetic. The way she laughed, the way she cared for the people around her, it was intoxicating. But as the months passed, something began to change. Her love shifted from being nurturing to something more obsessive, more possessive. I was no longer her boyfriend. I became her prisoner. After a long and painful struggle, I made the hardest decision of my life. I ended things with her. I thought it was the right move, the only move. But the aftermath wasn't what I expected. It wasn't just the emotional aftermath, the guilt, the regret, the sleepless nights. No, there was something much worse. It was the phone calls. I still remember the first one. It came 2 days after I left her, just as I was settling into my new place. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. But the peace didn't last long. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. It was an unknown number. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if it was a wrong number. But there was a sick feeling creeping into my stomach, and something told me that this wasn't a simple call. I answered. The line was dead silent at first, like the caller was waiting for me to speak. I waited for a voice, any sound. But then I heard it. Heavy breathing. I called out, but there was no reply. Just the steady inhale and exhale of someone on the other side. It wasn't normal, wasn't human. The kind of breathing that came from a person whose mind had already slipped into something darker. I hung up. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. I told myself it was probably nothing. A prank, maybe, or some strange coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was her. And I was right. The calls didn't stop. The next night it came again. Same time. Same number. And this time I wasn't about to just let it go. I picked up the phone, and before I could even speak, I heard that breathing again. Only this time there was something different, something wrong about it. Why did you leave me, Michael? The voice on the other end was barely a whisper, but it cut through me like a knife. And that's when I realized she wasn't letting me go. The next few days were an endless cycle of unease. Every time I picked up my phone, there was that nervous hesitation. My heart would race when I saw an unknown number flashing across the screen, my fingers shaking as I wondered whether I'd hear that voice again. And it wasn't just the phone calls. Something else was happening, something much more sinister. It started with the small things, little disturbances that didn't make sense at first. Like the time I found a small, handwritten note on my doorstep. It wasn't signed, and the paper was yellowed, as if it had been sitting in the elements for a while. The words were simple but chilling. I know where you live. I laughed it off, trying to tell myself it was a prank. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach refused to go away. And then the second note came. This one was slipped under my door, written in the same rushed, barely legible handwriting. It simply said, "You can't hide from me." I tried to tell myself it was some random person, maybe a neighbor playing games. But deep down I knew. I knew this wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. It was Maya. Somehow she knew where I was. She knew where I lived, and she had made it clear that she wasn't going to let me go. The phone calls kept coming. Each time the same eerie breathing. Each time I would pick up, and each time the voice would ask me the same thing. Why did you leave me, Michael? Then came the night I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was late, around midnight, and I was sitting alone in my living room. I'd been going through some paperwork, trying to distract myself from the creeping anxiety that had settled in my chest. The phone rang again. Same unknown number. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, hesitated for a second, and finally answered. The breathing. The same rhythmic, suffocating breathing. But this time there was something else, something new. A sound almost like a whispering, something that wasn't human. It was a language I couldn't understand, an undecipherable hum that sent cold shivers down my spine. Then, through the haze of static, I heard her voice. Maya's voice. You're making me do this, Michael. I felt a chill run through me. I opened my mouth to speak, but I couldn't form the words. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me, suffocating me from all sides. Please, Maya, stop, I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. But there was no reply, just the eerie sound of something shuffling, like footsteps moving in the background. The call ended abruptly. My hand dropped from the phone, and I sat frozen, staring at the screen. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to understand what was happening. Was this really her? Was it possible that she had found me? How could she do this from so far away? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing. This was no coincidence. She was getting closer. I spent the next few hours trying to calm myself down, pacing around my apartment, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, like a shadow was lurking just out of sight. The atmosphere was thick with unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to make her move. At around 3 a.m., I received another call. I had to answer this time. I couldn't avoid it any longer. As I picked up the phone, my heart hammered in my chest, every beat pounding in my ears. There was the heavy breathing again, but it wasn't just that. There was a low, guttural growl mixed in, like something dark was taking control of her voice. Michael, she whispered, and my blood ran cold. I was about to say something, anything, but before I could speak, the voice continued. You left me. You think you're safe, but you're wrong. You can never escape me. There was a sharp, sick laugh that followed her words. I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear, my hand numb with fear. My mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. This wasn't just about revenge. She had changed. Maya was no longer the person I had known. Something had twisted inside of her, and now she was no longer human. She had become something else. I won't stop, Michael. I will find you. I'll always find you. The words hung in the air like a curse. I hung up, my body drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to shake off the fear, to tell myself that it was just mind games, that she was just trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew that it was much worse than that. This wasn't just emotional manipulation. This was obsession. This was a descent into madness, and I was the object of her insanity. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I had to leave, to find a way to escape this nightmare. I quickly packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and rushed out the door, locking it behind me as if that would somehow keep her away. I drove through the night, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, and every car that passed felt like it was watching me, stalking me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that she was out there, following me, waiting for the moment when I would slip up. The phone calls didn't stop. They came through at every turn, every moment of weakness. The unknown number, the breathing, the whispering voice. You can't hide from me, Michael. The road stretched out before me like a dark, endless tunnel. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, convinced that I was being followed. No matter how fast I drove, the feeling didn't go away. Every light that flickered in the distance made my heart race. Every car that passed felt like a reminder that she was out there. My mind was no longer rational. I was consumed by the thought that Maya was somehow always a step behind me. I had to stop, get away. But where? I needed answers. The calls kept coming, of course. At first, I thought maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me. The fear had a way of distorting reality. But it wasn't. Every time I picked up the phone, The voice on the other end was clearer, colder. Her laughter had turned from a hollow, twisted sound to something more intimate, as if she was standing right beside me, breathing down my neck. "Michael," she said that night, her voice so close it was almost like a whisper in my ear. "You think I'm just a ghost, don't you? A memory you can shake off. But I am real. I am right here, and I won't let you forget me." I slammed the phone down in a panic, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But just as I did, a strange sensation washed over me. A presence. Something in the air shifted, and for the first time since I left her, I could feel her in the room with me. I looked around, my eyes scanning the empty car. I told myself I was being paranoid. I tried to reason with myself. This was all in my head. But the sensation of her gaze, her unblinking eyes watching me, was unbearable. I had to stop. I couldn't keep running. I was at the edge of the world, but she was already in my head. Maya had gotten under my skin in ways I hadn't even realized until now. The night was growing colder, and the wind began to howl, rattling the windows. My breath fogged up the windshield, but it wasn't the cold air that chilled me. It was the realization that I was not alone. I turned off the road and pulled into an old, abandoned gas station. It was the perfect place for the madness to reach its peak. I needed a moment to collect myself, but I knew deep down that this was where the end would come. I shut off the engine and sat in the silence of the night. My breath was shallow, my body tense. And then the phone rang. Again. I picked it up, already knowing what would happen. The line clicked as the call connected, and once more the slow, steady breathing filled the air. "Michael," Maya's voice said, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, almost real, almost like she was right there in the car with me. "Why are you running? I told you, you can't escape. You belong to me now." My heart pounded in my chest, the cold sweat on my back sticking to my shirt. I tried to answer her, to tell her that I hadn't wanted this, that I never meant to hurt her. But before I could say anything, there was a new sound, a sound that froze me in place. It was the sound of someone scratching at the window. I slowly turned my head to look, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, outside the car, pressed against the glass, was Maya's face, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth stretched into a twisted grin. She wasn't just calling me from a distance anymore. She was right there. I could see the reflection of her face in the glass, her features distorted, as if something had taken over her body. Something dark. Something evil. I screamed, a primal sound that tore from my throat as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, and the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there. Still watching me. I drove for hours, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, but there was no sign of her. Maybe I had escaped. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. But deep down I knew better. I kept hearing her voice in my head. That whisper. That laugh. And then, when I least expected it, the phone rang again. It was the same unknown number, the same heavy breathing on the other end. I answered it, my hands trembling. "Why didn't you listen to me, Michael?" she asked, her voice sharp, biting through the line. I could feel my sanity slipping away with every word. The tension in the air was suffocating, the silence in the car too loud, too heavy. I tried to say something, but I was interrupted by a cracking sound from the back seat. I turned quickly, panic setting in as my heart raced. There, in the rearview mirror, I saw a shadow move. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but it was there, someone sitting in the back seat. I whipped my head around, my eyes wide with terror, and saw the seat empty. But I just knew. She was there. Maya had crossed into my reality. She was no longer just a phone call, no longer a voice on the other side of the line. She was here. She was in my life, in my mind, in my soul. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the car came to a halt. The world outside was silent. Too silent. I sat frozen, staring at the rearview mirror, waiting. But there was nothing. And then suddenly the phone rang again. But this time there was no breathing. No voice. Just a single line of text on the screen, a message from Maya. I'm already inside. The words on the screen burned into my eyes. I'm already inside. My mind couldn't comprehend it. It felt like the world around me was collapsing. For a moment, I thought I had lost my grip on reality. My hands trembled as I glanced at the empty rearview mirror, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to leave, to run, but I was frozen. It was as if the terror had paralyzed me, making it impossible to move. Then slowly, my eyes shifted down to the floor of the car. There, beneath the seat, was a faint shadow, something out of place. The air in the car seemed thicker now, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped. I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. She was here. Maya had somehow crossed that final line between reality and nightmare. She wasn't just some lingering memory or a haunting voice anymore. She was inside my car, inside my mind. I didn't have to turn around. I could feel her, feel the weight of her presence closing in. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was impossible. My entire body was trembling, not from the cold, but from the absolute dread that seeped into my bones. Michael, her voice was a whisper, a breath, so close that it seemed to come from within me, from the very air that surrounded me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free. But every instinct told me that screaming, fighting back, running away, none of it would matter. Maya had won. I slowly reached for the door handle, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But before I could even try, the lights in the car flickered once, twice. The engine sputtered. And then, for a split second, everything went silent. Then the world exploded. The car lurched forward as if an invisible force had grabbed it, slamming my body back against the seat. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure standing just in front of the car. I couldn't breathe. It was Maya, but she wasn't standing in front of the car. She was standing in front of me, inside the car, in the back seat, staring at me with those empty, lifeless eyes. I froze. The world around me collapsed into a blur. Her grin was wide and twisted, so wide it seemed unnatural, like it stretched farther than it should have. She was grinning at me, and the laughter, her laugh, echoed in my ears. "You thought you could leave, Michael," she said softly, her voice a low, almost affectionate tone. "But you can't escape me. Not now. Not ever." I snapped out of my trance, adrenaline coursing through me as I yanked the car door open. I stumbled out into the night, my legs weak, my head spinning. I needed to get away. I needed to run. But when I turned around, she wasn't there anymore. The back seat of the car was empty. I felt the blood drain from my face as I glanced over my shoulder. Maya was nowhere to be seen, and the car seemed eerily quiet, almost too quiet. For a moment, I convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was still just having a nightmare. Maybe I'd finally cracked under the pressure. But the sound of footsteps behind me cut through the night like a knife. I whirled around, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the darkness, was Maya. But this time, she wasn't smiling. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids, and her mouth was twisted into a sickening, unnatural shape. Her entire body seemed to shudder with rage. She took a step toward me, and I could feel the ground beneath me tremble. The world around me was becoming more and more surreal, like the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of hell, Maya whispered, "I told you, Michael. I'm inside. And now you're never getting out." My body froze. I felt something dark, something suffocating, begin to consume me. I couldn't move. Everything went black. I woke up in the middle of the road. My car was gone. The night had swallowed up everything, leaving nothing but silence. But I wasn't alone. I could feel her presence beside me. Maya's grip on me had never loosened. I had escaped. For now. But I knew better. She would come again. And next time, she wouldn't let me run. The question remains, how do you escape someone who's already inside you? Can you ever truly outrun the terror of your own mind? Share your thoughts, or if you've had an encounter like this, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your chilling stories. It was supposed to be a fresh start, Emma thought moving to a new city would bring her peace after everything that happened with her ex. But it didn't take long for the shadows of her past to catch up with her. The first few days went by smoothly. She settled into her new apartment, started her new job, and even met a few people who made her feel welcome. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had escaped her past. But the past doesn't just disappear. It was late one evening when she first noticed something was wrong. She had just come home from a long shift, tired but satisfied with her day. Her apartment was still and silent, too silent. Emma walked in and immediately felt the weight of the air in the room, thick with an unsettling tension she couldn't shake. It was like the walls were pressing in on her, the darkness in the corners of the room somehow deeper than it had ever been before. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked on the notification. The message was short, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm still watching you." Her heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be him. She hadn't heard from her ex in months. She had changed her number, moved to a completely new city. Everything was supposed to be over. Yet here she was staring at a message that made her skin crawl. The only thing Emma could think of was the chilling way he used to look at her. The way his presence would hover even when he wasn't physically there. Emma quickly looked around her apartment, checking the locks, the windows, making sure everything was secure. But something told her that wasn't enough. The thought of him creeping around her life again filled her with dread. She knew what he was capable of. He had been obsessive, manipulative, and terrifying. No matter how much she tried to move on, he would never let her go. The message wasn't the worst part. It was the photo that came right after. A picture of her apartment, taken from outside her window. The past was back, and this time, it wasn't content to stay in the shadows. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. No matter how many locks she double-checked, no matter how tightly she pulled the curtains across her windows, the creeping sense of unease never fully left her. She had moved here to escape him, to get away from the nightmares of their toxic relationship. But it seemed like the ghosts of her past were far more persistent than she could have imagined. After receiving the chilling message and the photo, her first instinct was to contact the authorities. But what could she tell them? She had no proof. No evidence that the message even came from her ex, and certainly no way to explain how the photo was taken unless she admitted that she suspected he had found her, tracked her down, and was stalking her again. She had no way of knowing for sure. All she had was a creeping terror that he was watching her every move. As the days passed, the messages grew more frequent, each one more cryptic and disturbing than the last. Some days, she would wake up to a message waiting for her, like a sinister reminder that she could never escape. Other times, it was a series of vague and unsettling texts, each one hinting at a reality that she was too afraid to confront. The tone of his messages started to shift, too. He was no longer just a distant, haunting figure from her past. No, this time he was speaking as if he were right there with her, breathing down her neck, waiting for her to break. "I see you've been shopping for new curtains. I'd recommend locking the windows a little tighter next time." That was the first one that made her stomach churn. How did he know about the curtains? She had only just bought them that morning. Emma's heart raced as the realization set in. He was close. He was watching her. The second message came a few hours later. "I wonder if your new neighbors are as friendly as you think. It's a shame the walls are so thin. They might hear us talking soon." That's when Emma started to feel the weight of his presence. It was suffocating. He wasn't just a name from her past anymore. He had become an omnipresent force, lurking in the shadows of her life. He knew things about her, things she hadn't shared with anyone. Her once peaceful apartment was now a trap. Each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, each gust of wind rattling the window panes, felt like a signal, a warning. Something was about to happen. Something terrifying. Emma couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. She needed to know who this was, who was tormenting her from the other side of the screen. Late one evening, after another round of ominous texts and photos, this time, a picture of her front door, taken from across the street, Emma decided to confront the situation head-on. She couldn't keep hiding in fear. She had to face whatever was happening. With a racing heart and shaking hands, she grabbed her phone and dialed the number she had hoped never to call. It had been a long time since she had reached out to him, but now she was desperate. Her ex, who had haunted her life for months, had been nothing short of a nightmare. His obsessive tendencies had once made her feel trapped, suffocated. And now, after all this time, he was back, sending her disturbing messages that made her feel like she was losing her mind. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity, each passing second tightening the knot in her stomach. Just as she was about to hang up, a voice she had hoped never to hear again answered. "Hello, Emma." It was him. The sickening calm in his voice made her skin crawl. He hadn't changed. If anything, he sounded even more calculating than before. "What do you want?" Emma forced the words out, trying to sound stronger than she felt. But inside, her heart was pounding against her chest, her mind racing with panic. "I want you to stop running, Emma," his voice purred. "You can't escape me. You never could." Emma's hand tightened around the phone, the grip almost painful. He had always been like this, controlling, possessive, and manipulative. She had left him because she couldn't bear his suffocating love anymore. But it seemed like her escape had only led to a deeper, more terrifying trap. "I don't want anything to do with you," she spat, her voice shaking. "Leave me alone." The silence on the other end was heavy, and Emma could almost hear the smile in his voice when he finally spoke again. "You're not the one who gets to decide that," he said softly. "I'll always be a part of your life, Emma. You can't change that." Her blood ran cold. He wasn't going to stop. She had known that from the moment he had started sending her messages. But hearing it from his mouth made it all the more real. Before she could say anything else, the line went dead. Emma stared at her phone in disbelief. Her hands were trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What was she supposed to do now? It didn't take long for the nightmare to escalate. The following days were filled with a whirlwind of terror. Emma began noticing things around her apartment that she couldn't explain. Small, subtle things like objects out of place or windows that were slightly ajar. Each morning, it felt like the walls of her apartment had shifted just a little bit more. Then the sound started. Late at night, when Emma would be in bed trying to sleep, she began hearing the faintest scratching noise, almost like nails on wood. It would start softly, barely perceptible, but as the night wore on, it would grow louder and more frantic. At first, Emma thought it was the building settling, but soon she realized that it was something far worse. Something was trying to get in. She was no longer alone in her apartment. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with a sense of impending doom. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. Each night, she lay awake, terrified that something, or someone, was out there just beyond her reach. She knew it had to be him. Her ex. He was here, in the city, in her life once again, making her a prisoner in her own home. It had been 3 days since Emma had spoken to him on the phone. 3 days of pure, unrelenting terror, each minute dragging her closer to the edge of sanity. The messages had continued, each one more cryptic than the last, each one pushing her further into a spiral of dread. The worst part was that she had no idea where he was. She would look out her window, scanning the streets for any sign of movement, but all she saw was the same quiet street, the same peaceful view. It felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the suffocating grip of fear that had taken hold of her life. But tonight was different. It had started like any other night. Emma had gone to bed early, trying to escape the relentless thoughts racing through her mind. She pulled the covers tightly around her, trying to shut out the darkness that seemed to be closing in on her. She had tried everything, locking the doors, closing the windows, checking every corner of her apartment. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Then around 2 a.m. it began. The faint scratching noise. At first it was soft, almost like the wind tapping against the window. But then it grew louder, more distinct, like nails dragging across wood. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She lay perfectly still in her bed, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like someone, or something, was trying to claw its way inside. Emma's mind raced. No, this couldn't be happening. She had checked everything. There was no one outside. No one could be in the apartment. But still that sound persisted. Her breathing quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She tried to get up, but her body was frozen in place, trapped in the grip of fear. The scratching continued, relentless and maddening, until it sounded like it was coming from directly outside her door. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Dead silence. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She strained to listen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it had been her imagination. But then, just as she was about to convince herself that everything was fine, she heard something else. A low, muffled thud. Someone was at the door. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Her thoughts raced. Should I call the police? Should I hide? But her phone felt miles away, and the idea of getting up, walking into the hallway, and confronting whatever was on the other side was unimaginable. The thud came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. Her ex was here. With shaking hands, she slowly reached for her phone, but before she could even unlock it, the door handle began to jiggle. He was trying to get in. Her mind was spinning. What did he want? Was this it? Was he going to hurt her? She had been running for so long, but now it seemed like there was nowhere left to run. The door handle rattled again, more violently this time. The sound was deafening in the silence of her apartment. Emma closed her eyes and gripped the blankets tightly, her body trembling in fear. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. All she could do was listen. And then it happened. A loud crash. The door exploded inward, slamming against the wall with such force that the entire apartment seemed to shake. He was inside. Emma's heart leapt into her throat as she bolted upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror. In the doorway stood a shadow, tall and imposing, the figure of her ex, his face obscured by the darkness, his silhouette menacing and powerful. "You thought you could escape, Emma?" His voice was cold, calculated, sending a wave of icy terror through her entire body. Emma was paralyzed, unable to move, her legs numb beneath her. The man who had tormented her for so long was standing right in front of her, his presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't obey. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then the man took a step forward, and Emma's body screamed at her to move. But it was too late. The moment he stepped forward, she felt it. Something sharp and cold pressed against her skin. She looked down to see the gleam of a knife in his hand, its blade catching the dim light from the street lamp outside. "You didn't listen, Emma. You never listened," he hissed, his voice laced with venom. "But now I'm going to make you." Emma's breath hitched in her throat. Was he going to kill her? In that split second, something inside her snapped. The terror, the helplessness, everything that had built up over the past few days came crashing down, and in a wild, desperate moment, she did the only thing she could think of. She lunged at him. With everything she had left, she shoved him with all her strength, sending him stumbling backward into the corner of the room. The knife flew from his hand, clattering to the floor with a sickening sound. But he wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to give up so easily. He regained his balance quickly, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you can escape me?" he growled, his voice dripping with rage. He lunged at her again, this time grabbing her by the wrist, squeezing it with an unrelenting grip. Emma cried out, struggling to break free. But there was no way out. She was trapped in the grip of a madman, the walls of her apartment closing in around her. The room seemed to spin, and she could feel her strength draining away with each passing second. But then, just as she thought it was over, a loud crash echoed through the room. The front window shattered, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the police. They had arrived just in time. Before Emma's ex could react, he was tackled to the ground by the officers, who quickly restrained him, pulling him away from her. The man howled in fury, but it was no use. His reign of terror was finally over. As the officers escorted him out of the apartment, Emma collapsed to her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was free, but the fear, the trauma, the memories of everything that had just happened, it would stay with her for a long time. The air was thick with tension as the police finally left, taking Emma's ex with them. The officers had reassured her, telling her that he wouldn't be able to hurt her anymore. But Emma knew better than to believe in easy resolutions. Her hands still trembled as she clutched the blanket around her body, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one question lingered, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. How had he found her? She had been so careful. She had moved to a new apartment, changed her number, deleted her social media, and cut off all contact. Yet there he was, right back in her life, terrifying her in ways she thought she had escaped. As the minutes ticked by, Emma's heart rate slowly began to stabilize. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a strange numbness. She should have felt relief, but there was an underlying dread she couldn't shake. The terror wasn't just in the events that had unfolded. It was in what she had learned about herself. How far had she truly gone to escape him? And had it all been enough? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of her phone. A message. Her hand froze midair, her heart lurching in her chest. It couldn't be. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the screen. The message read, "You may have gotten rid of me, Emma, but I'll always be with you. I never really left." A chill ran down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the words. Impossible. It had to be a joke. A sick game. He was locked away. But still, the message felt too real, too chilling to ignore. Emma's pulse quickened. She glanced nervously toward the door, as if expecting him to burst through at any second. But the apartment was silent. Everything was still. Her phone screen seemed to glow ominously in the dark, casting an eerie light across the room. She quickly typed a response, trying to shake off the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. "What do you want from me?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm already here, and I will never stop. Not until you are mine again." Emma dropped the phone, her mind reeling. The apartment felt suffocating now more than ever. What had she missed? What hadn't she done? She turned to the front door, which had been broken down in the chaos. The police had secured it, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The heavy silence in the room seemed to grow louder, and Emma felt the weight of every inch of her apartment pressed down on her. As she walked over to inspect the door, a sudden realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The door was locked from the inside. The officers had left, but they hadn't locked it behind them. No one could have gotten in without her knowing. Emma's breath hitched as she backed away from the door. Something was wrong. Something didn't add up. She slowly turned around, her body stiff with fear. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to get out of that apartment, but she couldn't move. She couldn't leave. And that's when she heard it. A soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under the weight of someone's step. It was coming from behind her. Emma spun around, heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was empty. The shadows seemed to grow, swallowing the space around her. She took another step forward toward the noise. It was coming from the closet. The door was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness spilling out from the crack. Emma couldn't move. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to get out of the apartment, but she was frozen in place. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet door. And then she opened it. The closet was empty. Or so it seemed. As she scanned the shelves, a small object caught her eye, a single, crumpled piece of paper, wedged in the back corner. Her heart stopped as she unfolded it. In a messy, frantic handwriting, the note read, "I never really left, Emma. You're still mine." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The air went cold. And before Emma could react, the door slammed shut behind her. Her screams were swallowed by the darkness. It had been 2 years since Olivia had left her ex, Ryan, And yet, every night, she felt his presence in her life like a dark cloud looming over her. The breakup had been messy, filled with anger, bitterness, and emotional wounds that refused to heal. But Olivia had finally taken the step to break free, convinced that she could move on and rebuild her life. She moved to a new city, a fresh start, away from the chaos, away from him. It was supposed to be a clean break. The new apartment felt like a refuge at first. No old memories, no reminders of Ryan's possessiveness or the toxic cycle they had fallen into. For the first few months, things seemed normal. Olivia felt free for the first time in years. But that freedom was short-lived. It all started with the strange messages. At first, she brushed them off as a coincidence, a glitch in her new number. But when the messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last, Olivia knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just that Ryan was still trying to contact her. It was the tone of the messages. They weren't desperate or pleading. They were calm, almost calculating. The first one came a week after she had moved in. "I know where you are." At first, she thought it was a prank. The second message was even more unsettling. "I know what you're wearing." Olivia had changed her number, blocked all social media accounts, and kept her new address a secret from everyone, except for a select few people she trusted completely. But this wasn't a coincidence. She realized Ryan had always been good at tracking her down. The more she thought about it, the more she feared the worst. Then came the photos. Photos of her apartment building. Photos of her walking to work. Photos of her sitting in the local cafe where she liked to go every Sunday morning. Each one was taken from a distance, but Olivia could tell it was him. His obsessive attention to detail was unmistakable. The messages stopped for a few days, and Olivia thought she was safe. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase, that maybe it wasn't him. But deep down, she knew that Ryan was out there, watching her every move. One evening, as she was settling into her couch with a cup of tea, she glanced out the window. The streetlights bathed the quiet street in a dim orange glow, and for a brief moment, Olivia felt at peace. But then her heart skipped a beat. There, across the street in the shadows, stood a figure, just barely visible in the corner of her window. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was Ryan. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just a figment of her imagination. But the more she stared, the more certain she became that the figure was real, and that it was him. Her pulse raced as she backed away from the window. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Another message. This one was different. This time, it wasn't from Ryan. It was from an unknown number. "Look out your window." Her heart sank. Olivia's hand trembled as she stared at the message. "Look out your window." Her gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, towards the window she had just been watching. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't imagined it. He was there. She took a step back, her body tense as though the room was shrinking around her. The faint outline of Ryan's figure, illuminated only by the dim light of the street lamps, seemed to stretch across the pavement. He was standing still, watching. Waiting. Her mind raced, heart pounding in her chest. How had he found her? She'd been so careful. She had moved across the city to get away from him, changed everything in her life, hoping it would be enough. Yet here he was, standing outside her window as if nothing had changed, as though he'd never left. She quickly turned to lock the window. Her hands were shaking so violently that it took her several attempts to slide the lock into place. But it wasn't enough to calm the panic rising in her chest. Olivia backed away from the window, her breath coming faster, the sensation of being trapped slowly suffocating her. She grabbed her phone, her fingers tapping on the screen, typing a message, and then deleting it. What could she say? "Why are you doing this?" would never be enough. She was scared, terrified. The terror of the situation was consuming her, and yet she couldn't bring herself to call the police. What could she say? That a man from her past was standing across the street? No, she thought. The only thing she could do was stay calm. She needed to stay in control. Her phone buzzed again. The message was short, simple, and it sent a cold shiver down her spine. "I see you. A scream built up in her throat, but Olivia swallowed it back. No, she wasn't going to let him break her. She had been through too much to let him win. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't stay here. She couldn't be alone, not while he was out there, lurking in the shadows. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of her apartment before it was too late. She snatched up her keys and rushed to the door. Her pulse raced as she opened it and stepped into the hallway of her building. She was about to head down the stairs when she hesitated, hearing something, a faint sound from behind her. A soft shuffle, a step too deliberate, too heavy to be just the building settling. Olivia whipped around, her heart stopping in her chest. She didn't see anyone, but that was almost worse. She could feel it. Someone was here, close. She wasn't alone. She took another step toward the stairs, but a noise behind her made her freeze. The sound was unmistakable, a slow, rhythmic knock on her apartment door. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she stood frozen in place. Was it him? Was he somehow already inside? She barely dared to breathe, standing motionless, her heart threatening to burst out of her chest. The knock came again, louder this time. Olivia quickly turned and bolted down the stairs, her feet pounding against the steps as she ran to the exit. She had to get away. She didn't know how or where, but she had to leave. She had to get out before it was too late. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she realized the streets were eerily quiet. The world seemed distant and muffled. She glanced around, her pulse still racing, but there was no sign of Ryan, no figure standing in the shadows. She kept moving, her steps quick and panicked. She needed to find somewhere safe. Her thoughts scrambled together in a frantic whirl. Could she make it to her friend Sarah's house? No, that was too far. The only place nearby was the 24-hour cafe she had visited earlier that week. The familiar sight of the cafe's neon sign glowed faintly in the distance. Olivia made her way toward it, each step weighted with dread. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so exposed, so vulnerable. She was never this jumpy. Not before. Not with Ryan. Her eyes darted around, scanning every corner, every shadow. It was dark, but it wasn't quiet. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of a car engine, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps, following her. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest as she quickened her pace. She couldn't be sure, but she knew she wasn't imagining it. Someone was behind her, watching her. She dared not turn around. She didn't need to see who it was to know. The fear of Ryan's eyes, those cold, dead eyes, lingered in the back of her mind like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Olivia reached the cafe and rushed inside, breathing a sigh of relief. The warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the cold night, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging in her mind. She quickly glanced around the cafe, her eyes scanning every table. It was empty. She sat down at the farthest corner, as far from the door as possible, hoping no one would recognize her panic. But the silence seemed to press in on her, suffocating her thoughts, tightening around her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to pretend like nothing was wrong, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her phone buzzed once again, and she jumped, startled by the sound. She quickly glanced at the screen, expecting another message from Ryan. But this time it was different. The message was from an unknown number. "I know where you are." Olivia's breath caught in her throat, her body freezing in shock. She quickly dropped the phone, her hands trembling. She didn't know if she could take much more of this. What was happening? Was Ryan really here, watching her, taunting her? No one in the cafe seemed to notice her distress. She tried to calm herself, to tell herself that this wasn't real, that she was just imagining it. But every instinct in her screamed that she wasn't alone. She wasn't safe. Her eyes flicked to the door. The bell above it jingled as it opened, and she froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. There, standing in the doorway, was a man. Not just any man. Ryan. Ryan's figure stood framed in the doorway of the cafe, his face partially obscured by the dim lighting. Olivia's heart stopped for a moment, her pulse spiking, her breath catching in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body remained frozen, unwilling to obey. Her mind raced. How? How had he found me here? Olivia. Ryan's voice was smooth, almost soothing, but it sent a chill down her spine. There was no warmth in it, only a coldness that resonated deep within her bones. I told you I'd never leave you. She wanted to scream, to shout at him to stay away, but no sound escaped her lips. The room seemed to grow smaller as he stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring every second of her fear. The air was thick with tension, and Olivia could feel the weight of his presence bearing down on her. He took another step, then another, closing the distance between them. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't move. The fear was paralyzing. Why are you doing this? Olivia managed to choke out, her voice trembling. She tried to sound strong, but the fear was overwhelming, seeping into every word. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, each beat louder than the last. Ryan's lips curled into a twisted grin. Why? Because I can, Olivia. Because you belong to me. You always have. And you always will. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, to escape, but her body refused to cooperate. The fear was too much. The thought of running was impossible, as if her legs were glued to the chair. Ryan's eyes locked onto hers, a predatory gleam in them that made her stomach churn. He was getting closer now, his footsteps echoing in the silence, filling the room with an oppressive weight. He reached the table, his hand slamming down on it with enough force to make the whole surface shake. Olivia flinched, her heart racing. She wanted to get up, to run, but she couldn't. Not with him so close. You didn't think I'd let you get away, did you? Ryan's words were low, venomous. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. You're mine, Olivia. You always have been. A rush of panic flooded through her. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, as if something was pressing down on her. She struggled to move, to break free from the invisible chains that held her in place, but it was no use. Suddenly, she felt a cold, clammy hand grip her shoulder. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock. Ryan was right behind her. She hadn't seen him move. He was there, breathing down her neck, his hand digging into her skin like a vice. Don't run from me, Olivia, Ryan whispered, his voice soft but laced with malice. You can't hide from me. Olivia's mind raced. She had to do something. Anything. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The cafe, the people, the world outside. It was all a facade. There was no safety here. There was no escape. Not from Ryan. She took a shaky breath, slowly standing up, trying to gather her composure. The fear was still there, gnawing at her insides, but she couldn't let him see it. Not now. Not after everything he'd put her through. She turned to face him, standing tall, doing her best to hold her ground. You're sick, she spat, her voice filled with a newfound defiance. You think you can control me? That you can make me your prisoner? Ryan chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Oh, Olivia, you still don't understand. It's not about control. It's about love. My love. The kind of love you don't deserve, but I'm giving it to you anyway. Her hands trembled as she backed away, but she couldn't stop herself. She knew she had to find a way out, but it felt like the walls were closing in. Ryan was everywhere. His eyes, his presence, he was consuming everything. She turned toward the door, her legs finally moving again, but Ryan was faster. In one fluid motion, he grabbed her arm, spinning her back around to face him. Where do you think you're going? He sneered. There's no escaping me. Olivia struggled against his grip, but his strength was overwhelming. The fear coursed through her veins like fire, but there was one thing she could do. One thing that might buy her the time she needed. She took a deep breath, then with all the strength she could muster, she drove her knee into his groin. The impact was brutal, but it worked. Ryan's grip faltered for a moment, enough time for her to break free. She didn't stop. She ran. Olivia burst through the door of the cafe, her heart pounding as she sprinted down the dark street. The world around her seemed a blur as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't think. She couldn't process. All that mattered was getting away from him. She ran for what felt like hours, until her legs gave out, and she collapsed in a dark alley, gasping for air. She had no idea where she was, but she didn't care. She just needed to rest, to catch her breath. But then, from the darkness behind her, she heard it. A voice. Olivia. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't possible. He shouldn't be here. He couldn't be here. She turned around, her eyes scanning the shadows. But there was no one there. The alley was empty. For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt wrong, like something was lurking just beyond the reach of her vision. And then she heard it again. Olivia. The voice was clearer this time. Closer. Ryan was here. Her blood ran cold as she slowly turned toward the sound. There, standing in the alley, was Ryan. His eyes locked onto hers, the same twisted grin stretching across his face. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare. Did you really think you could escape me? Ryan's voice was cold, almost pitying. He stepped closer, his face inching toward hers. You belong to me, Olivia. You always will. The world spun around her, her vision blurring as she realized there was no escape. No way out. No one to save her. Ryan reached out for her, his hand cold against her skin, and she knew in that instant that it was over. There would be no escape,